By way of introducing our first guest, I'd like to go all the way back to 1989 and show a clip of her Oval Office visit when she was 9 years old, and then I'll ask her to come to the stage.
How are you? Goodness, where are you from?
Los Angeles.
You came all this way?
Yes.
No kidding. Good to see you.
Oh, wait a minute.
Well, it's an honor to have you here. And I'm going to light this, and then that'll kind of give a lot of hope to a lot of other people. Look over this way. That's it. And I won't burn you, I promise. There you go. You look so pretty.
Thank you.
You get a new dress, I bet.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Thank you.
Just terrific. Okay.
Thank you.
Now what do we do? Should we keep the candle blowing or should we let it go? Let's blow on it and both wish.
Okay.
Hope it comes true, because I wish to bet you. Hi. Come in. How are you? Nice to see you. Nice to see you, sir. Well, this is fun having you all here. Family photo? Okay, here, we'll do it like this then. That's wonderful. Now tell me, how were you chosen? How were you chosen to be this? Let me say hello to these guys.
President's Foundation.
Good to see you. Nice to see you, Bert. Thanks for coming. It's like good to see you. Nice to see you, sir.
She was selected from a competition from across the country.
Is that right?
She was selected as that winning kid.
Well, first, we went and I was chosen the Los Angeles County Epilepsy Society poster child, and then we filled out an application, and I was one of the lucky ones to be chosen for.
Yeah. Now, do you have to go to a lot of other places besides coming to see me? I mean, like when you're a poster child, you go to other states and everything?
Yeah.
Some. She's going to have a busy day on the Hill this afternoon.
Are you going up there? Capitol Hill. You ever been to the U.S. Capitol before? Remember the one with the great big dome on it? Have you ever seen it?
Yeah, I've been.
Oh, you already been there? Oh, well. You're like it anyway, going back.
I know you have to cut down on your budget, but please don't cut down on the medical research.
We try not to do that, because it is important. It's very important. Not just for this, but for so many other diseases. Cancer, AIDS, and so many terrible diseases. So we'll try hard. Nice to see you. Now, wait a minute. I got to give you a souvenir. There's a souvenir. You don't have to wear it, but it may be better not on that beautiful dress, because I wouldn't want to get your mom sore at me.
Thank you.
These are his.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. President.
Any other business? Better look inside. Sometimes the last time we had a box, somebody got an empty box, and I wouldn't want that to happen.
President,
Yeah?
you know you're supposed to be in school right now.
Are you?
Do you think it would be possible for you to write me an absence?
Oh, absolutely. Sure, I should have thought of that myself. Here, you can have your choice of what paper to put it on. Which of these two? Which do you think she'd like best? Okay. And Larissa, how do you spell it? L-A-R? And what's the teacher?
Mrs. Chessel.
Mrs. what?
Chessel.
Checel.
Dear, I forgot to put the dear on it. Dear Mrs. Chessel, please give L-A-R-I-S-A, one S, right?
One S.
Larissa and excuse. You see, she came to see me. Amen. Sincerely. This ought to do it. May 23rd? Yeah. Is it 23rd?
23rd.
89, 11:45 a.m. You think she wants an envelope? Then, yeah, maybe you gotta give her everything.
Oh, let's want to fix that way.
This is kind of the formal way you do this, so instead of saying it's the courtesy of. Sure glad you came. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Remind me of some of my grandchildren.
See,
We got six, or let's see, we got 7 granddaughters, and yeah, there's a bunch of them over there. How old are you?
9.
I don't think we got any 9-year-olds. We got a couple of 8s, twins, Dallas. Nice to see you.
Okay,
Nice to see you, Tom. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
President.
Good to see you.
Nice to meet you, President.
Nice to see you. Bye. Bring your letter sometime. Okay. How are you?
All right, I'd like to welcome to the stage Dr. Larissa DeSantis. She is the former former poster child and spokesperson for Epilepsy Foundation of America, and as you can see, quite a spunky little 9-year-old. Despite having 30 to 40 seizures a day, she grew up in a world with the ADA and never felt limited by her disability. Although she initially wanted to follow in the President's footsteps, she has since pursued her passion in the natural world. Currently, she is Assistant Professor of Earth and Environmental Sciences at Vanderbilt University. She received her degrees BS, MEM, and PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, Yale University, and the University of Florida, where she studied the environmental and paleontology, especially assessing how ancient mammals responded to changes in environment and climates. Her scientific research has been featured in numerous radio, online, and television outlets, including MSNBC, NPR, and National Geographic Wild. While she never learned what President Bush wished for her, she is grateful to the ADA and the hopes his wishes come true. Our next guest is Ambassador C. Boyden Gray, is a founding partner of Boyden Gray & Associates, a law and strategy firm in Washington, D.C. focused on constitutional and regulatory issues. Mr. Gray worked in the White House for 12 years, first as counsel to Vice President Bush during the Reagan administration, and then White House counsel to George H.W. Bush. In this capacity, he was counsel to the President's Task Force on Regulatory Relief and was instrumental in the enactment of the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 and the Energy Policy Act of 1992, as well as the development of cap-and-trade systems for acid rain emissions. In 1993, he received the Presidential Citizens Medal. Under President George W. Bush, Mr. Gray was U.S. Ambassador to the European Union and U.S. Special Envoy to Europe for Eurasian Energy. Mr. Gray practiced law for 25 years at the law firm of Wilmer, Cutler, and Pickering, and was chairman of the Administrative Law and Regulatory Practice section of the American Bar Association from 2000 to 2002. He was adjunct professor at NYU Law School and is on the board of directors of the Atlantic Council and the European Institute. He earned his A.B. magna cum laude from Harvard and his J.D. with honors from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he was editor-in-chief of the Law Review. Mr. Gray served in the United States Marine Corps, and after law school, he clerked for Earl Warren, Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Our third guest is Lex Frieden, professor of biomedical informatics and rehabilitation at the University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston. He also directs the Independent Living Research Utilization Program ILRU at TIRR Memorial Hermann. ILRU is a research, training, and technical assistance program on independent living for people with disabilities and seniors. Frieden has served as chairperson of the National Council on Disability, president of the Rehabilitation International, and chairperson of the American Association for People with Disabilities. He is recognized as one of the founders of the independent living movement by people with disabilities. He was instrumental in conceiving and drafting the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. I think what we're going to do is we'll start, have each of our panelists give a short statement, and then I've got some questions, and if we have time, we'll open up the questions to the audience. Now, Larissa, in the film we just saw, and unless you're looking really close, you don't notice that one of the last things President Bush says to you is right. And you never did you?
There are a lot of things I remember very clearly, but that was actually one I didn't realize he had said until just about a month ago when I saw the footage again.
So you've written him a letter.
I have. So it's a bit related, but I thought today would be a fitting day to read you a few excerpts from the letter that I have given to you. Now, I'm going to preface this by saying I have barely been able to hold it together coming up to stage, so I can't promise there won't be tears. Dear President Bush, it is hard to know where to start, so I'll begin with a simple thank you. I'm forever grateful for your dedication. Sorry. I am forever grateful for your dedication and commitment to individuals with disabilities, or rather, people with different abilities. I speak not just for myself, but for millions of individuals you have helped by reducing discrimination, enabling us to engage in daily life activities, but most importantly, for allowing us to dream. I clearly remember meeting you, making a wish over the Epilepsy Society's Light of Understanding, and you saying, I hope my wish comes true because it is about you. Because of this, I grew up wanting to become the president, obviously. A congresswoman first, that was also inspired by former Congressman Tony Coelho, a primary sponsor of the ADA who also has epilepsy. I never for one moment thought I couldn't achieve my dreams. And my switch to becoming a scientist was for me a lateral move. I fully believed I could have become president, but didn't know if I really wanted that job. It's a tough one. You allowed me to dream big and never let anyone question my abilities. It is no coincidence that my current research lab at Vanderbilt is also known as the Dream Lab, although it stands for Dietary Reconstructions and Ecological Assessments of Mammals. Nevertheless, you still inspire me to be the best scientist, educator, mother, and citizen I can possibly be. To be honest, I don't really know a world without the Americans with Disabilities Act. I grew up in a country that prohibited discrimination against those with disabilities and that helped make accommodations for all individuals. Because of the ADA, I was able to participate in the same activities as my peers, including attending a marine science camp that involved snorkeling in the ocean. Accommodations were made so that I could attend, including having an adult swim partner in case I had a seizure while in the water. When I was in high school, my co-president was in a wheelchair, but this never affected anything we did, anywhere we went, or activities we planned for the school. Further, I made the mistake of playing co-ed intramural basketball with forestry students about twice my size and broke my pelvic bone in college. Because of the ADA, even though this was only a temporary injury, I was able to continue to attend all of my classes, keep my job preparing dinosaur fossils, and get around town, including public transit and on campus, without any issues. I'm thankful to you and so many others for making a world with the ADA a reality. Now, as a mother, I'm even more grateful to you for allowing my children to grow up in a world where accommodation, not discrimination, is the law. As an educator, you have made me and others constantly aware that students have different abilities and the importance of working with students with a diversity of strengths. As a scientist, you have forced me to dream big and ask questions of broad relevance to society, including clarifying how life is affected by changing climates and environments. Few people in this world have changed as many lives as you have. You have changed mine and that of millions of Americans for the better. Thank you. P.S. I thought it might be worth a mention. I had to miss class today to attend this event. And I'm sure an absent excuse note to my departmental chair or chancellor could excuse my absence. Thank you.
Thank you. Lex, you are the grassroots of the ADA. Would you like to talk?
Well, first of all, thanks. It's a real privilege for me to be here, and I want to thank the library and I want to thank everybody who's responsible for this program. But most of all, I want to thank President and Mrs. Bush for their ongoing support of the ADA. From the very beginning, when we went to Vice President Bush, who said, as we left the meeting, remember, I'm just the Vice President, but if I can help you more someday, I will. And, well, 2 years later, history will record, he was the President of the United States, and at the first opportunity he had before a joint session of the Congress, he said we need to have a law like the ADA. That actually changed a lot of minds in the Congress. We had been lobbying, hundreds of us, in Washington, D.C., on Capitol Hill. We had been in cities and towns across America trying to get people to hear our prayer that there be a non-discrimination law, something protecting us from the kind of discrimination that affected my friends and myself. And after the President announced his support of our initiative, I can tell you that members of Congress who before had not been eager to see us welcomed us and immediately began to sign on to the ADA bill as co-sponsors. It takes that kind of leadership and, frankly, the kind of bipartisan leadership that President Bush provided was exceptional. Last week, Tom Harkin was making a speech in Minnesota to a celebration like this. And Senator Harkin said, you know, this law wouldn't have happened without George Bush making certain that it was a bipartisan law, that it had the support of both Republicans and Democrats. And I think that's a real tribute to what we've achieved with the ADA, and it's a kind of a lesson for all of us, I think. If you have a righteous purpose and a great leader, you will find support, and we were fortunate to do that. But we started with literally dozens and then hundreds and then thousands of people with disabilities who were willing to speak and to talk about how important this was. I'm missing two great friends here tonight, Justin Dart Jr. We shouldn't have this celebration without mentioning a great Texan and a real leader of the disability community, and some of us call him the father of the ADA. Justin went to all 50 states 3 times trying to get people with disabilities to understand what we were trying to achieve. And the other friend, Evan Kemp, who was on the stage with the president when the bill was signed, and frankly, President Bush in that video talked about the importance of employing people with disabilities. Under his direction, Evan Kemp was appointed the chairperson of the EEOC, the first person with a severe disability who was leader of a federal agency at that time. And I miss them both dearly, and I know President Bush, you miss them and many others who were with us in the great fight. But tonight is a night to celebrate, and we can celebrate our achievements here tonight, and so glad to be here with you. One final thing I'll add. We had, in July, close to the anniversary date of the ADA signing, there were a lot of celebrations in Washington, D.C., and I had the privilege of introducing President Bush and Barbara's grandson, Pierce, who spoke at one of those large celebration gatherings. And Pierce gave a beautiful tribute to his grandfather, talking about how he continued to support the rights of all people and the inclusion particularly of people with disabilities. And at the end of his remarks, Pierce said, "You know, I don't believe my grandfather ever anticipated being a person with a disability when he worked on and signed the ADA, but he is now. And he can identify with the mantra, the chant of the disability organizers now, nothing about us without us." And when Pierce said that, 1,500 voices in that auditorium began to chant, "Nothing about us without us," as George Bush's picture was put on the screen behind Pierce. It was a wonderful memory.
Thank you. So Boyden, in many ways yours was getting it done and written, and
Well, I couldn't have done it without Lex and Evan Kemp, and of course the president, who was always, I think, a natural for the job. I don't know that any other president could have done quite what he did. I was told by several experts, Lex can probably expand upon this, that there was never a politician in America who was as comfortable and natural with people with disabilities as President Bush. And so it was a very natural thing for him to be the leader of this effort. And it was an extraordinary privilege for me to work sort of at two ends of the spectrum with President Bush on one side and the work he did when he was Vice President, and Lex and Evan and Justin and others on the, if you will, the grassroots side. It's been one of the great pleasures of my life. I want to say, just to sort of illustrate what the act meant, that when President Bush mentioned in his signing statement, in his speech about this being in the hands of businessmen, shortly before his term was over, I was visited by a retiring executive at Walmart who had been with Walmart since it was founded, who was head of Washington Affairs, and he had politely, gently, was a good Southerner, prodded me and poked at me about this statute when it was undergoing the lobbying phase, legislative phase, and he was opposed to it. Walmart was opposed, at least initially. And he came in to say goodbye to me, but also to say, he said, you know, I visited you several times, and I was wrong. This has been the greatest thing that's happened to Walmart in recent years. The employees we have who are disabled are the most loyal, dependable employees we have. We've had a flood of disabled people now flocking into our stores when they didn't have access before. It's been an unparalleled success, and I was wrong, and I am sorry, and congratulations. So I always remember that anecdote. This was something that I think very few other presidents could have achieved, and I think I want to point out quickly, without going into detail, that nearly, 200 countries, Lex, have copied the ADA, and I don't know of any other American statute that comes anywhere near close to that kind of international recognition and imitation. Now, this wasn't all without some humor and gaiety. There was a time when President Bush wanted to have Evan Kemp, who's on, you can see him on your program, he's pictured here, to dinner with his girlfriend, whose name was Janine Bertram, and she was a problem for the Secret Service because she had been incarcerated, jailed as a weatherman, or perhaps we would say today, weather person. And she was convicted of aiding and abetting the escape or some such thing. But she won an award for being the most helpful and productive convict in her jail. And she was a great favorite of the Bushes, and they were naturally very upset when the Secret Service stopped her at the Northwest Gate because she had this rather obvious criminal record. And I can remember an irate president calling down to the Secret Service saying, "I want this woman up here now, right now." And of course they let her in very quickly, I think. It shook up the Secret Service quite a bit. But Evan Kemp was a great pioneer, and he graduated not too many years before I did from law school. He was 2, 3, 4 years ahead. I think he was number 3 in his class at the University of Virginia Law School, and he could not get a job because he was in a wheelchair. And this, of course, would never happen today, but that's a measure of how far we've come, Lex, to think that someone in that time, in the early 60s, could not get a job because they were in a wheelchair. One of the examples that I always remember of the president's comfort with disabled people was when a group of mentally impaired kids came in from California. I think it was a group called California First, if I'm not mistaken. And the president, then vice president, spent about a half an hour with them, joking and laughing. And then he looked at his schedule. It was sort of late-ish afternoon, and said, "You know, there's nothing on the president's schedule. I think I'm going to take these guys down to see the president." So without even calling up to find out whether he was busy or not, he just walked down the corridor with 15 or 20 of these kids, and they spent 45 minutes with President Reagan. And I wasn't invited, unfortunately, so I couldn't tell what had happened. I felt quite left out. But it was an extraordinary example of the leadership of both of them and their compassion for people who had been excluded from the mainstream of life. It was an important thing, I think, for Evan Kemp politically. He never thought that the politics of the disability movement should be considered somehow improper. He rejoiced in the fact that the disability movement could exercise power through the grassroots, through people like Lex, to get Congress to enact this statute. Not much persuading was needed with President Bush, but there were a lot in Congress who did need it. And I think it made a difference in the 1988 election because President Bush campaigned on it. Of course, Governor Dukakis couldn't oppose it after the president had beat him to the punch on supporting it, and so it became a bipartisan mandate even before the election was over. And Lee Atwater told me that he expected the spread between President Bush and Dukakis was, I think, 8 percentage points, and he said that the swing in the disabled vote could have accounted for nearly half of that. So this was a very important thing politically, and as I say, Evan Kemp was never ashamed of the political aspects of this, and it showed up, of course, in the fact that you've heard now several times. This was an amazingly bipartisan effort. Senator Harkin is still talking about it. Senator Kennedy was one of the leaders. I never appreciated Senator Kennedy's humor quite so much as I did when this act was underway. I don't really have anything else particular to say about this except that I want to thank those people with disabilities who made this all possible, Lex, you, and the other Evan and Justin, and the opportunity, of course, given to me by President Bush to be associated with this effort. It is, I say, one of the great joys of my life and one of the great privileges of my life.
Thank you. So Larissa, first question's for you. So you were a pretty self-assured 9-year-old. What was it like to be the epilepsy poster child? Where did you get to go? And for a 9-year-old, how did that experience affect your life?
It was a pretty incredible experience, and it provided a silver lining to what often could be a challenging childhood. It was one of those things that I realized that if I didn't have epilepsy, I wasn't the person that I fully became, and I wouldn't have had the opportunity to be able to help so many other folks. One of the main roles was to try to let other children know what epilepsy was, and so I did a series of videos. One is I Have Epilepsy Too, and it was sort of a simple video where we sort of went through the process of what it's like to be diagnosed. So what is it like to have an EEG? It looks like a very scary procedure, putting electrodes on your head, but in fact it's painless, and you get to stay up late at night and stay up till midnight and with the hope that you will have seizures and they will monitor them. And also, about blood tests and the various process of how you get diagnosed. So I also met lots of other children through various epilepsy camps that I participated in as well, who became friends, and also worked with other organizations and did telethons to try to raise awareness and money for various causes, and so worked with Easter Seals and other groups. I had the fortune of meeting President Bush in the Oval Office, which was an amazing experience, and also meeting with folks like Tony Coelho. That was very important as well because he had epilepsy, and he was not allowed to go into the seminary. And seeing pictures of him riding, I can't remember if it was a horse or a bull, but he was doing some sort of rodeo riding, and seeing that was possible was also really important. And so there was also the role of trying to convey to others that folks with disabilities have different abilities and that we can do many things. So that was also another role.
I think Lex pointed out in a program we had this morning that he wanted to be a Catholic priest, but he was disabled. He had epilepsy, so instead he went into politics. It's funny how those things work, isn't it? And became an advocate for the Americans with Disabilities Act. So sometimes, God works in mysterious ways. Lex, a little bit of Irish in me, and I'm a Southerner, so we always like a good story. So in '87, when you're trying to get the ADA introduced in Congress, you testified before the Senate Labor and Human Resources Committee hearing about an experience with discrimination that you had 20 years shortly after you broke your neck in a car crash. That's a great story. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, I was a freshman in college at Oklahoma State University when my neck was broken in a late night, too late at night, and too many beers and too many drivers on the road that had too many beers and not enough safety belts, and just too many college kids doing the wrong thing at the wrong time. And by the way, if you have a child, counsel them about the risk of driving, not themselves, but with somebody else who may have been drinking, because I was actually in the middle of the back seat, the safest place to sit in the car. When we had a head-on collision, there were 5 of us in the car and 6 of us in the car. We hit. All of us went to the infirmary. In town, in Stillwater, the students weren't allowed to go to the community hospital because the local folks thought we needed to belong to the campus, so we took to the infirmary where they treated sore throats and mononucleosis. And I was on a stretcher there for quite some time. The nurse and the doctor who was there, a pediatrician that night, thought they would triage, and so they were treating the students who had the cuts and bruises before me. I didn't have a scratch on me, but I couldn't move, and the nurse thought I might have been overheated or be in shock or something like that. By the time I saw the doctor, I was probably was in shock because I had so many blankets on me. She was trying to warm me up. After that, I went to rehabilitation at Tier Memorial Hermann in Houston and went back to Oklahoma. And I knew I just didn't feel right about going back to OSU. I'd been a student there. There were steps everywhere on the campus. I couldn't imagine being there. My mother was helping care for me and my father. At that point in time, I needed daily assistance. And we were moving then to Tulsa. And as luck would have it, Oral Roberts had just become a Methodist and built a huge university, Oral Roberts University, on the plains outside Tulsa. And I applied to go to school there because this new built school had level entrances everywhere and ramps to every building. It was built according to then modern 1968 standards, which were not bad, actually. And my application was turned down. I thought there was a mistake. I called the Dean of Admissions. He said, you know, I have your file. You received the right letter. And I said, well, then did you get my transcripts? I was valedictorian of my high school class. It couldn't be my grades. And he said, yes, you did well in school. And then I said, I made in the top 5 percentile of the college admission exams. And he said, you did well in the testing too. And then I thought, well, no, Oral Roberts, it's a religious school. And I said to him, did you get my letter of recommendation from my Methodist minister? And the dean said, yes, you did very well in Sunday school too. So I said, what could possibly be the problem then? Why can't I come to school there? And he said, you've indicated on your application that you use a wheelchair for mobility, and our policy is not to admit students with disabilities on the campus. And I couldn't speak. I mean, I couldn't talk to my parents about that. I felt embarrassed. I felt guilty. I'd spent more than a year recovering from this trauma and believing I could go on to do great things. And here I was told, for no reason for which I had control, obviously, that I wasn't going to be able to do that. It really was might use the word sobering experience after all of that. And I was fortunate. A friend of my father's said, I went to school at the University of Tulsa across town. You should apply there. And I said, it's an old school. They're trying to look like the old Harvard. They've got steps and ivy everywhere. And I couldn't possibly go there. And he said, go and talk to the dean. Well, the dean met me on the tarmac. I couldn't get up the curb. I couldn't get into any of the rooms to meet. His office wasn't accessible. But he said, Lex, you're the kind of student we want at the university. I said, but I can't get in the buildings. He said, first thought was we could have students carrying you up and down the steps. And I said, I don't want to impose on other students. And then he said, look, there's a new building over there. It'll be finished by the fall. Take this catalog home. That building has level entrances and an elevator. It's the first building we've built in 25 years. And if you'll call and tell me what classes you want to take, they'll be in that building. And I call that the miracle on the plains of Oklahoma.
So if you wanted a class, it was in that building.
It was in that building, and I graduated 3.5 years and went on to graduate school. But that lesson, by the way, later on in 1976, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 included a provision for non-discrimination among programs that were federally sponsored. And the government didn't do regulations for it, so it was a law without any opportunity to implement it. And finally, the Department of Labor began to work on some regulations, and they invited me and some other people to come and talk about what those regulations would look like. And we presented the idea of having what's called a reasonable accommodation, which actually became the core of one of the provisions of the ADA. And that idea for a reasonable accommodation was based loosely on the experience I had there at Tulsa, where they didn't have any accessible buildings, but they made do with the one they had.
They made a reasonable accommodation.
They did.
And of course, you got a letter from Oral Roberts University many years later.
It's probably in your library archives right now, as a matter of fact. The letter from Oral Roberts apologized for their act of discrimination. The letter was sent as a result of a federal investigation that occurred subsequent to the passage of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. So at that point, we knew laws worked. We just needed one that covered more than government buildings.
So if you wanted to go to university today, you'd be able to do it.
I think any student in America who wants to go to any university in America will be very welcome, as long as they have the grades to support themselves and so on.
Thank you. All right, Boyden, let's talk a little bit about the history of the ADA. So can you talk about the initial involvement of 40 and 41?
Well, there were several statutes that nibbled around the edges of what became the ADA. One was the Rehabilitation Act that Lex just talked about, and others, Education for All, Handicapped Children Act. So it wasn't a new topic when Vice President Bush took office with President Reagan. President Reagan put him in charge of the Task Force on Regulatory Relief, and we were faced instantaneously with issues involving rules and stuff that had come out of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and one of them was an agency known as the ATBCB. It took me nearly 12 years to get it down so I could call it the ATBCB, but that's the Architectural and Transportation Barriers Compliance Board. How about that for a mouthful? And they had promulgated at the end of the Clinton administration a very, very comprehensive set of rules that were really prescriptive and probably in many cases unnecessary, if not indeed counterproductive. They did things like, and I don't want to make fun of it, but if I could, I probably would, but they had requirements that they have signs on grass in parks in Braille saying do not walk on the grass. And it's just not something where, not a place where too many people with disabilities would end up feeling around to see whether there's a Braille sign somewhere. And we had to push back on that because it was really, really prescriptive and really expensive. And I was very nervous. But Evan said, and others like Lex said, hey, you'd be surprised what happens if you say we don't want this paternalistic kind of treatment. So don't be shy about it. And we had to wrap enough votes from the various agencies involved to freeze the regulations, but it was met with huge applause by the disability community, which I think was a breakthrough moment for many of us working on this, that it was really true that this was not an effort by a group to get a handout from and special favors from government. So that's really how it started. There were many other aspects that came up during the course of the 8 years, you know, the kind of thing that would bring this California First group in to visit then Vice President Bush. But he was well prepared, both knowing the people involved, from Lex Frieden on, Evan, Justin, knowing the people involved, as well as knowing the issues. So it was not an unnatural thing for him to have pushed for during the campaign and made a priority once he became president. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Well, one of the amazing things about this act is it's bipartisan. It was supported by many people on both sides of the aisle. I guess there's a question if could an act like this be passed today? We might get that in a little bit to that in a little bit. But who were some of the allies for you in the administration and on the Hill that helped get the act passed?
Well, I think most of the cabinet and White House staff who became part of President Bush's government were, I think, exposed to these issues during the vice presidency. So I don't think that everybody was an ally in the executive branch. I don't think there was anybody who was opposed. I know, and I may be treading on some sensitive turf here. I know that Governor Sununu's taken a couple of shots for being allegedly opposed to this, opposed to that, but he was a sometimes volatile character who could explode one minute and the sun would shine within 30 seconds later. So many stories of his opposition, alleged opposition to things, were grossly exaggerated. He was key to the implementation of it, to the negotiation of it, after President Bush became, Vice President Bush became president. On the Democratic side, there were, well, you've heard the names. Congressman Coelho was absolutely key from the very, very beginning, maybe the most important, or the most important person in the House, although Congressman Bartlett was also very important and still is a supporter. And on the Senate side, Harkin and Kennedy were probably the key supporters. But there was never any organized opposition in either party, if you can believe it. I think the thing had been handled so well politically by Vice President Bush running for president. It was handled so well in the political run-up to the election that, as I say, it was a bipartisan foregone conclusion virtually once the election was held. And there were obviously difficult negotiations over language, over precise language, and there still are problems of interpretation. An act had to be passed in 2008, which was signed with great pleasure by another Bush, 43, as he's known. So it's still evolving, but I don't think there was any real organized resistance in the political realm, and not that much in the business community, believe it or not, after we got into it.
Okay. So Lex, this morning you talked about the meeting you had with Vice President Bush in 1986. So you had worked the grassroots effort to get this act passed, and it kind of culminated in a meeting in 1986 with President Bush. At what point did you think that your dream was going to come true, the law would get passed?
Well, I think there were three or four points which were keys that we stood back and said, now this is going to work. The meeting with Vice President Bush was the first. And after we had that meeting, after we left that meeting, we understood that we could communicate at least to someone who had some degree of personal experience or understanding with disability. So that was an important test to see how the administration responded, and that made us feel reassured. Later on, when Vice President Bush was elected president, we took another deep breath and had cause to cheer. I remember on the night of the election, I think after the counting was done, I phoned Boyd and Gray in his hotel room and said, I think we're going to go now. And those were important moments. When the bill was introduced in the Congress the first time, we had a hard time finding somebody who was willing to sponsor this particular bill because it was so massive. It cut across every aspect of American life. And legislation like that was really hard for Congress to consider. That bill had to go through 4 committees in the Senate. It had to go through many more in the House. It had more than I think that set a record number in terms of the hearings that were had. And at some point, the bill stalled in early 1990, and that's another point at which we kind of had to catch our breath, and then were relieved at the outcome. And that's when about 200 people with disabilities went to the Capitol and literally took themselves out of their wheelchairs and climbed up those steps to the Capitol to get the attention of Congress to say, you just can't sit here, we want you to act. And then the result, obviously, the Senate passed the bill on final passage. It was a record at that point, 91 in favor to 6. And those were all meaningful points. Clearly the first one was when the Vice President said, this is meaningful, I understand this, and we should do this.
A question for each of you. It's 25 years since the act was passed. Did you envision where we would be, where we are today? And then on the flip side, what are maybe where are we still lacking? Where do we need to go? I'll start with you, Lex.
Well, I mean, briefly, we had a vision, and that vision was captured so well by President Bush when at the signing ceremony. Everybody's seen that tape. It was eloquent and well articulated, and we all shared that vision. I think our biggest disappointment was early on, and even today, the difficulty that people with disabilities, despite access to education, despite access to public services and everything else that's happened, the difficulty they have finding good jobs. And frankly, I think there may be some relief by the baby boom generation now aging out, retiring, and those are a lot of jobs that I think people with disabilities will be able to fill. That's the other thing that we did not anticipate when we worked on the ADA. I don't think anyone at the time was looking so far ahead that they could consider the impact of the aging of the baby boomers. So we'll have, by the year 2020, more people with disabilities in this country that need help in the home than we do today. And those are challenges that we have to look at ahead now.
Wayne, same question.
Well, probably the answer pretty much the same. The act has been an enormous success internationally, as I said, and an enormous success domestically in terms of what it's meant for people with disabilities, in terms of public acceptance. Indeed, now almost sort of not even noticing, which is really the end triumph on public attitudes. But I do think the employment issue has always been a difficult one. It has some of it has to do with insurance, how insurance works. If you go off disability onto a regular job, you lose that, and then it's hard to get it back. And there've been back and forth on that, and I think that still needs some work. But I'm with Lex. I'm very positive about the future. Technology has advanced so much to help all kinds of disabilities get through the day in ways that were not simply thought of in the time that we were working. And the high-tech community has been among the strongest business supporters of this legislation.
Larissa?
So as a child, I really grew up since the ADA was enacted. So my view of the world is very different, and I'm very grateful to all of you for being able to grow up in a world that largely has prohibited discrimination and has allowed for accommodation. That being said, there are always challenges to discrimination of all sorts, disabilities, gender discrimination, and these are all things that can also be challenging to prove and demonstrate. And so I think it's important that people recognize the abilities that folks with disabilities bring to jobs, a different perspective. There is a world-famous paleontologist who studies small invertebrates, Vermeer, who's at UC Davis, and does amazing work. And perhaps being blind has allowed him to have a vision of things beyond what we could come up with. So I think it's important to recognize the commitment of folks with disabilities, the abilities that they do possess, and that, like you mentioned, they're often more dedicated employees, passionate about what they do, and that I'm hopeful that eventually we will continue to sort of plod down this path and where there's less and less discrimination, especially by employers. And it is a challenge.
And I'm reminded of a scientist whose name has escaped me, who studies ants. He's blind in one eye, and he looks at things close up with his eye, and he's an expert on ants, and possibly because he only has vision in one of his eyes. Is there a question? Is there something I didn't ask that that you think is important that maybe I missed?
Well, I would make one comment, again, on a topic that might be considered somewhat sensitive, but relates to a question you didn't ask. Could this act be passed today? And I sometimes wonder, given the polarization of politics, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure the Republicans would embrace it the way they did wholeheartedly back in the 80s. One of the things that I think is important for people to understand is that one of the sources of opposition to the international treaty, which hasn't quite made it, was the right to life community. I don't know really why, but they were totally supportive of this legislation because of protection that it gave to people with disabilities who were brought to term. And that was a very important source of support, and it's something I think people here should be aware of. The civil rights community, at the same time, was very, very supportive, obviously. So you had this convergence of the right to life community and the civil rights community supporting the same piece of legislation, which is not has not been common in our recent history.
Ladies, gentlemen, thank you all, and to our panel, thank you very much. It was a pleasure, and I'm glad you all came from so far away to be with us tonight. If you will remain in your seats for just a moment, we're going to give President and Mrs. Bush a chance to exit the theater. We have a reception in the lobby. Please join us for that reception, and thank you for being with us tonight.